You're listening to a 3CR podcast created in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.
Welcome to the anarchist world this week. The sacred cows have wandered in a little bit early, which is fair enough. It is cold out there and there is a drought. So obviously they're looking for food. Fortunately, there's no hay here in the studio. Now, a few interesting things this week and next week you may want to attend. The first one is tonight. That's the 28th, Wednesday, the 28th of May, 6:30pm start. Dinner at La Porquetta's for all those listeners south of the river, down Frankston Way. So it's at La Porquetta's in Frankston on the main highway. You can't miss it. Come and join us. Interesting people. Interesting conversation, pay for your own food and drinks. So turn up and be part of that particular scene, as they say, or they used to say. I assume they don't use the word scene anymore. That's tonight at 6:30pm start. Just turn up. You don't have to book. Just turn up and 6:30pm start. And hopefully we'll see as many people there as possible, considering all that effort that so many people put into the Flinders campaign. It'd been nice to see some of those people turn up as well as other people. As I said, what we try to do is we try to organise social engagement between people, get away from the Zoom culture out there and some live interaction. People make friends, they make contacts, they get involved, and that's what these dinners are all about. Now, next Tuesday, that's the 3rd of June. Tuesday, the 3rd of June is Mabo Day. And once again, the Ellen Jose Memorial Foundation, a foundation which was set up to honour the life of my late wife, Ellen Jose, has organised a Mabo Day celebration. It's at Federation Square, near the corner of Flinders Street and St Kilda Road. It's actually right near St Kilda Road, across the road from the railway station, Flinders Street railway station, next to the flagpoles. Short ceremony between 30 to 60 minutes. You're all invited to attend and participate. I'll speak more about the significance of Mabo Day during the program proper, as they say. So that's two events that are on the calendar. Now, I hate to remind you, the 11th, which is only 2 weeks away, it's the 11th of June, is 3CR Radiothon for Anarchist World this week, and we're doing the You're Dreaming $20,000 campaign. We'd like to raise $20,000 during the Anarchist World this week for Community Radio 3CR. Now, you can get a warm inner glow, and that's up to you, by donating. You can actually get a legal, legitimate tax deduction by donating. I can't see why the listeners to the Anarchist World this week can't enjoy the same perks and lurks as the rich and infamous. If they can set up charities, why can't you donate to 3CR? So the 11th of June will be the special Radiothon program. We're trying to raise $20,000 during the hour. Can be done, may not be done, but can be done. It's the You're Dreaming Radiothon Anarchist World This Week campaign. The sacred cows have eaten their hay. They're out. They're rattling their tins. They're looking for Radiothon donations. So if there's a sacred cow turns up at your house, give it some money. Welcome to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. That's 3cr.org.au. The program is a podcast, so if you've got to leave for a variety of reasons, you can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. This program is coming to you from the studios of 3CR in Melbourne. It is broadcast across Australia, courtesy of those wonderful people at the Community Radio Network. My name's Joseph Toscana. If you want to leave messages, 0439 395 489. Anarchism, anarchos without rulers. What's the anarchist mission statement. You like that? Mission statement. Well, it's to create a society without rulers. Not without rules, but without rulers. What gives rulers the ability to determine the lives of billions of people? As we see when rulers open their mouths, interestingly, it's inequalities in power and wealth. So the anarchist struggle is the struggle to devolve power, possibly through direct democratic means, and the struggle to hold wealth in common and use it for the common good. Motherhood statements. Motherhood statements. Unfortunately, we're told every day of our lives that we are incapable of ruling ourselves. And if we didn't have strong rulers to tell us what to do, how high to jump, when to eat, we would fall amongst each other, killing each other. Well, I beg to differ, and I'm sure many listeners to the Anarchist will this week beg to differ, using the common knowledge and the common talents that we all have is the solution to many of the problems we face. Now, I'd like to start off with the joys of privatisation, and I'm using the word joys in inverted commas. See, a lot of people don't really understand what's happened in this country in the last 50 years, so I'm going to do just a short analysis. Initially, during the good old days, in inverted commas, the state was a mechanism by which rulers maintained their authority and power. That was his only purpose. Its purpose wasn't to look after the population. That's what was his purpose. Through the 19th century and early 20th century, through 2 world wars, people began to wake up and they demanded the state broaden its activities to actually provide for the needs of the people that were ruled. And that led to the formation of assets which were owned by the state, not the people, by the state, to provide services to the community. And we saw during the 50s and 60s and 70s a growth of state-owned assets in Western democracies. I'm not talking about so-called communist states where the state controls the economy as well as the people, but I'm talking about in Western democracies. We had an increased in the number of institutions which are owned by the state to provide basic essential services to the community. This is outside a social security net. Now, during the late 70s and early 80s, we had this ideological push in Western democracies to decrease competition. You see, when you have a private entity, even if it's a monopoly, competing with a state-owned entity, in society, you have real competition. Real competition, not the type of competition which the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission attempts to regulate, but real competition. So as we began to sell publicly owned assets which had been around, in some cases, like the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, for almost 100 years, what we saw is the lack of competition in Western democracies as far as economic issues were concerned. And that lack of competition led to the growth of monopolies, an increase in prices, and the inability of ordinary people, well, extraordinary people, obviously anybody listening to the Anarchist world, this world is not ordinary, but they're extraordinary people to actually have a direct impact on policies which were carried out by privately owned companies. When a company or a corporation is owned by the state in a Western democracy or a Western parliamentary democracy, you do have the ability to influence the government to change policies. So we saw a wholesale privatisation orgy. I know it's a strong word. We saw fire basement sales. We saw this country selling ports, airports, energy producing entities, telecommunications, Qantas, and the list goes on and on. Medibank Private, and the list just goes on and on. And as we've seen in Victoria recently, this orgy continues with the sale of the Titles Office, the privatisation of Vic Roads, and the list goes on and on. So we saw this ideology be put in place, and we were told, yeah, you and me, the idiots, you and me, I include myself in that privatisation would increase competition, decrease prices. Well, obviously the very different aspect has occurred. Now, privatisation has decreased competition. It's reduced the amount of money which goes to the Treasury, because many of these entities, like the Commonwealth Bank, were Telecom at that stage, were profitable entities, the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories. Now, I'll give you an example, just in case you think that privatisation is the way forward. Now, obviously, we've seen this with the privatisation of public housing at the state level across the country, and the increased prices which occur in the private housing sector. But I'll tell you a few little funny facts you may want to tell your mates, if you have any mates, or the people you meet in the street. The first fact is the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory was one of the first nationalised entities which was bankrolled by the federal government before World War I, because they understood the importance of having a facility which can produce vaccinations. Because unlike today, when people have forgotten the benefits of vaccination, in those days, people died, children died. And when Mr Paul Keating privatised the Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, I think you could buy a share for $2.40. Today, a CSL share, I think, is around $300. Great fire sale. Now let's look at another. Oh yes, the world's greatest treasurer, Mr Peter Costello, Howard's treasurer. He privatised the gold reserves. He got for the country, when he privatised most of this country's gold reserves, he got $200 an ounce, and everybody thought he was a hero. 20 years later, an ounce of gold costs around 5,000 Australian dollars. What a brilliant fire sale. Now let's look at the Commonwealth Bank. I think when the Commonwealth Bank was privatised by the Labor government, you could buy a share for around, I think it was about $5. Today, shares are around $170 each. Think about it. What a con. And the con occurred for one very good reason, because nationally owned assets do not belong to the people. They belong to state governments or federal governments. So if a government is elected for 3 to 4 years and it finds itself in a little bit of financial difficulty, the first thing they do is sell off a public asset which is providing significant services and in some regards providing revenue to Treasury. So there's no joys to privatisation. And we today are reaping those benefits. Trams, buses, social security, even the public service, the amount of private entities which are involved, NDIS, the list goes on and on. Somehow we continue to believe aged care. early childhood development, that giving these essential services and assets to the private sector, that somehow we, the people, will gain a benefit. So it's interesting to see that the Labor government in England is talking about renationalising essential services. Let's move on. The Tale of Two Cities. I'm not talking about the book, but the Tale of Two Cities. Now, if you live in Victoria, you may have seen some boneheads, attacking each other with machetes in a major shopping centre. Not a good look. The Labor government in Victoria passed emergency legislation within 48 hours to ban the sale of machetes in Victoria. Whether this does any good or not, who knows? At the same time, we have seen an increase of deaths at police hands in Victoria. Some have been quite well publicised cases which led to demonstrations in Footscray regarding the shooting of a homeless man. Now, the dilemma in Victoria, and this is what shows you how governments act. The dilemma in Victoria, if there is a police shooting, for whatever reason, I remember the tragic situation, I think it was over 10 years ago, when a 15-year-old was surrounded by 4 police and shot to death in Northcote, an inner city, suburb in Melbourne. And the fact there were minimal ramifications because the lad had a knife. But the thing is, police shootings, police killings, whether it's in a car chase, whether they're shot, are investigated by police. And then we're told the Police Ethical Standards Squad oversees the investigation. Then the case goes to the coroner makes a recommendation, everybody forgets about it. Now, there have been an increase of police shootings around Australia in the last few years. Now, I remember 20 years ago when this was a significant issue in Victoria, that changes were made to the way police responded to particular situations, and the number of police shootings decreased dramatically, but they've increased now quite dramatically. So it highlights how governments are very happy to tackle an issue where, wonderful support in the community. Whether it does anything or not is irrelevant, but at least it looks like they're doing something. But when it comes to establishing a special investigation force outside Victoria Police to investigate police shootings and then report to the government on each and every one of those shootings and see if anything can be done to diminish the number of lives which are lost, and in the majority of cases they're lives that are lost of people who are lost in terms of their health issues, their mental issues, not just, hardened criminals. Because hardened criminals know that this is not the type of way to act. So why don't we have a debate, at least, about having a force that is able to review police shootings, which is not run by the Victoria Police? It's a little bit like people saying, "Hey Joe, you just stole $50,000. "Oh, did I really?" "Yes, you did." "Well, I'm going to investigate and see what happened." And then I'll come back 3 months later and said, "No, I didn't steal $50,000. I borrowed it permanently." All right. So I don't want to make any, light of the issue. It's a serious issue. But it highlights in many ways how society functions. That there are issues that governments are willing to tackle and issues which I think are too difficult to tackle because of, how shall I put it, because of vested interests. So I wonder how many police shootings will it take around this country for various state governments to actually institute changes to the way they are investigated. For example, another death in custody in Darwin yesterday, a 24-year-old. What's going to happen? Police will investigate. It'll go to the coroners. It'll be another one of the 600 plus death in custody since the Royal Commission report in the 1980s. Nothing changes. So we need to understand that unless there is pressure from the public, and you won't get pressure from the legacy media or the corporate-owned Australian Broadcasting Corporation, you don't see maybe a expose on four corners regarding these particular issues. I don't have the facilities, you don't have the facilities, but we do have the ability to raise these issues. Listen to The Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. Look, I'd just like to encourage people to help us celebrate Mabo Day, irrespective of where you are in the country. Now, obviously, people in the Torres Strait will be having a public holiday on Mabo Day because they see this as a significant day. The further south you get, the less interest is shown in Mabo Day, and I can assure you that in Melbourne town there'll be very little happening on the 3rd of June to mark the 33rd anniversary of the Mabo Day decision. But the Ellen Jose Memorial Foundation will be holding a small vigil and ceremony on Tuesday, the 3rd of June, at midday at Federation Square under the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags in Federation Square near the corner of Flinders Street and St Kilda Road. So meet us there. Now, on the 3rd of June, just a little bit of history, because, history does have an impact on what we think, how we act, and how we celebrate. On the 3rd of June 1992, 33 years ago, the High Court of Australia ended the legal fiction the Australian continent and the islands surrounding Australia were owned by no one. Terra nullius. It's very easy to close your eyes and despite the tens of thousands of deaths which occurred as a direct result of colonisation, to say nobody lived there. Terra nullius. When Australia was invaded and colonised on the 26th of January 1788, the British colonisers acted as if the land was uninhabited. Over 60,000 years of civilisation were swept away in an orgy of destruction that resulted in the violent dispossession of people who had a long and a productive association with the land and the seas surrounding the land. For 204 years, successive Australian governments acted as if the lands they had stolen legally belonged to them, while the original inhabitants, terra nullius, didn't exist, who had survived the colonisation process, as you know, were ignored, marginalised and legally discriminated against. It's a little bit like somebody saying, "Oh God, I like your house. If you don't piss off, we're going to kill you all." And then they move into your house and say, "Well, no one was living here. That's why we moved in. There was nobody here. We moved in. It's our place. Stuff, whoever was here before us, they just left. They weren't even here." In 1982, That's 194 years after this live terra nullius had been legally entwined into our constitutional arrangements. 3 traditional landowners from the island of Mer in the eastern Torres Straits, Eddie Koiki Mabo, Father Passy and Grandfather Rice, set in train a series of events that began in the Queensland courts during the Bjelke-Petersen era and ended up in the High Court of Australia in a close 4-3 decision, overturned the doctrine that Australia was unoccupied terra nullius at the time of the British invasion. The High Court of Australia on the 3rd of June 1992, that's 33 years ago, ruled that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interests in land and water survive the assertion by force of sovereignty by the Crown. In other words, it wasn't a nice thing to do. There were people here before they took over. Now, I was alive during those days, and it was amazing. The consternation that was caused and fanned by the legacy media, especially the Murdoch media, about the fact that we were going to have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people camp in our backyard and even the front yard and take it over. It didn't take long for the spirit and letter of the judgment to be buried in bucket loads of extinguishment by successive federal governments. Now, some people say the Mabo decision didn't go far enough. The fact that the Mabo decision went very far in terms of providing access to land to many Aboriginal groups and Torres Strait Islander groups. But the fact is that it was successive federal governments which actually watered down the legislation to such an extent that it became difficult to implement. 33 years after the High Court of Australia gave Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders rights to land in Commonwealth law, the question of sovereignty, a voice to Parliament, compensation, the extent of native title, and a need for a treaty between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians continues to be important impediments to reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians in 2025. I mean, ridiculous. 237 years after the place was initially invaded and colonised, we're still arguing about these things. Extraordinary. Now, this week is Reconciliation Week. It's bookend by the 1967 referendum, a National Sorry Day, and Mabo Day, which is the 3rd of June, and between the 27th of May and 3rd of June. Now, the loss of the voice referendum turned any prospect of reconciliation into a barren, parched, desert-like landscape. And the fact that people like you and me remember Mabo Day continues to water that landscape in an effort, that's right, in an effort to begin that process that should have been begun years, decades, over 100 years ago. Ellen Jose was a proud Torres Strait Islander. She was proud of the contribution of Torres Strait Islanders have made in the struggle to achieve reconciliation between the country's First Nations people and those who arrived since 1788. A reconciliation based on justice, not charity. It was her express wishes that her family and friends continue to organise events and activities to celebrate the gains made on the 3rd of June. So if you've got nothing else to do on the 3rd of June, Tuesday the 3rd of June, come and join us for a short ceremony to mark Mabo Day in Federation Square under the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags next to St Kilda Road in the corner of St Kilda Road and Flinders Street. You'll see us there. We'll have a large blue banner. Come and join us. Come and say a few words. The important thing is that we don't forget. If we forget, efforts to make Reconciliation Week a prominent week in this country's history will disappear. And considering how much hatred was stirred up by the Dutton-led Liberal Party and the National Party, especially the National Party, I think it's important, irrespective, of the Labor victory, that we mark these days and say this is unfinished business that needs to be finished. Let's move on.
You're listening to a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned to hear the rest of your 3CR podcast.
Let's move on. You're listening to The Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. This program is streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access it by going to 3cr.org.au. What are we going to do next? What will we do next? Sonic Healthcare. Now, Sonic Healthcare is part of a Canadian-owned equity fund. Now, if you don't know what an equity fund is, well, what they do is they roam the earth looking for investments or looking for entities they can actually destroy and make a buck out of. Now, Sonic Healthcare is the second largest provider of private healthcare in this country. And considering that if you earn above a certain amount, and many people find themselves in that bracket, you've got to take out some type of health insurance or you get it deducted from your tax. And the fact is that the failure of Sonic Healthcare, which had owned over 37 hospitals, is a big issue. Now, why did it fail? What happened to Sonic Healthcare is a copybook example of the pitfalls of allowing equity funds to actually invest in essential infrastructure. So the first thing that this Canadian equity fund did when it took over Sonic Healthcare is they laden it with debt. So debt from another project got laden onto Sonic Healthcare. They were hoping that Sonic Healthcare would be able to decrease that debt. At the same time, what you do, and this is all legal, this is what I love about it, what you do is you lease back the business. That's right, you lease it back in your own company. You lease it back to the hospital, so they've got to pay rent. Although the equity fund owns the hospital, they lease it back to themselves. But the hospitals have to pay rent, okay? So they're saddled with debt and they have to pay rent. And although I think it's over $4 billion is pumped into the private healthcare hospital industry by the taxpayer, you and me, through a subsidy. Otherwise, private healthcare would be beyond the reach of most Australians. So we've got this situation where this fake entity is set up. So when things get a little bit too hard and they realise, well, you can't really suck blood out of a stone. What you do is, because the way the business is structured is, you place the business into administration and liquidation. And you move on. You take your money and you go and destroy something else in order to make a buck. Fancy allowing an equity fund to take over such an important section of the private healthcare industry, which provides employment for over 19,000 people, and I think treated over 600,000 people in the last few years. What an extraordinary state of affairs we find ourselves in. This is not just a problem for Sonic Healthcare. It's a chronic problem. I mean, these equity funds are only interested in making a buck. They don't care what actually happens to people, the services they provide, the people they employ. It's about making a buck. They are your classical megalomaniacs, as far as capitalism is concerned. But we welcome into our house. It's a little bit like welcoming a tiger snake into the bedroom and then standing on the tiger snake. It's going to bite you. Listen to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia of other community radio network. Now, you all know that there are conflicts around the world, and some conflicts, like Ukraine and to a lesser extent Gaza and the West Bank, are conflicts that we kind of take an interest in. That's in the West. And then there are conflicts which have caused massive problems, massive dislocation, hunger, death. We kind of put aside. And I'd just like to make a few comments about the Sudanese situation. Because Sudan has a proud history, a long history that goes back to ancient Egypt. Long history. But in many regards, Sudan is a little bit like Australia. It has a lot of mineral wealth, especially in the western region. A lot of mineral wealth, gold in particular. And it's been known as a centre for gold extraction for thousands of years. Most of the Egyptian pharaohs got their golds from Nubia, which is obviously part of Sudan. Now, the Sudanese have been under a military dictatorship for over a quarter of a century. And about 3 years ago, that military dictator, al-Bashir, was overthrown. But the military continued to maintain control. Now, during the period when Sudan was fighting the South Sudanese and the people in Darfur, the military government created a paramilitary force, which English translation is devils on horseback. And they were responsible for mass murder, both in South Sudan, Darfur region. They were some of the most vicious, destructive paramilitary forces. Now, when al-Bashir was deposed from power, the Sudanese armed forces were forced into a temporary alliance with these paramilitaries, which were very well armed. And the paramilitary forces are now called the Rapid Defence Forces. Now, about almost 2 years ago, the Rapid Defence Forces attempted to take over the country. Over 11 million people have now been displaced. That's about 25% of the population. Thousands have died in that armed struggle between the Sudanese military, which, believe it or not, is seen as the heroes by most Sudanese, and the Rapid Defence Forces. Now, the question is, where are the Rapid Defence Forces getting their money? Who is financially supporting them? Who is providing them with arms despite the many atrocities they've been involved in? And you won't believe who it is. No, it's not the United States of America. No, it's not China. No, it's not Russia. It's the United Arab Emirates. That tiny little country is very keen to expand its borders, take over Sudan, and exploit its mineral wealth because they understand that the money that comes from their oil wealth will soon dry up. So most of the unnecessary killings that have occurred and displacement and the hunger that's occurring in Sudan today can be directly linked to the United Arab Emirates' support for the Rapid Defence Forces. Sometimes you have to look beyond what you see to actually work out exactly what's going on. You're listening to the Anarchist World This Week, broadcast across Australia via the Community Radio Network. Now let's take a little walk. I like taking walks. They're supposed to be healthy for you, aren't you? Now we're going to take a walk around Gaza. Now, Gaza is an enclave which has been shrunk down to an area about 8 kilometres wide, 45 kilometres, so long in length. So if you want to walk around Gaza, it'll be a 106 kilometre walk. So I'm going to take a 106 kilometre walk around Gaza, and you're going to come with me, and then we're going to go and take another walk. Now, the great thing about taking a 106 kilometre walk around Gaza, which is a particularly small enclave, and I'm not going to talk, the fact is, for every kilometre you walk, for the first 53 kilometres, there will be the bodies of Palestinians, mainly women and children and old people, about 80%, who have died as a direct impact of the Israelis' armed forces' actions in that area. It's not a war, it's carnage, okay? What's happening in Ukraine and Russia? That's a war. We've got sides that have got armaments. This is a carnage. Now, people talk about the 53,000 that have already died as a direct result of bombs. But how about all the others that have died who can't have access to medications? Blood pressure medications, diabetic medications, heart medications, vaccinations. Think about it. For every person that has died directly as a result of bombs and bullets, you've got another 2 that has died indirectly as a result of not being able to access basic medical care or enough food. So if you take a walk around Gaza, 106 kilometres, every metre you walk, there will be a body. Mainly of elderly people, women and children. Now, when you look at the pictures that come out of Gaza, and I pay my respects to those Palestinians who continue to report on what's happening in Gaza, because obviously foreign reporters aren't let in. And you look at the overwhelming force that has been used, as well as starvation being used as a weapon, food being used as a weapon, but that's a different story. where you've got hospitals that are bombed. We now got the situation where those brave pilots in the Israeli Defence Forces and those tank crews are bombing tents. It's good to see they've got that courage, isn't it? But the thing is, once we've finished our little walk, let's take another walk down a corridor. Because the fact is, the standard we walk past is the standard we accept. Now, we've left Gaza and I'm taking another little walk, I've survived that horrific experience, and I'm taking another little walk down this corridor. And on one side, there's Ukraine, and on the other side, there's Gaza. And as I walk down that corridor, I can see the damage and the carnage that's been inflicted in the Ukraine. But then when I look on the other side, I can see the total devastation that's occurred in Gaza. Now, if I can see it, world leaders can see it. Our Prime Minister can see it. The Leader of the Opposition can see it. We can see the difference. We're all very, and I've got no problems with this, we're all very, very vocal in our condemnation of the Russian attacks and atrocities in the Ukraine. And let's not forget, the people of Ukraine do have an armed forces, they do have a navy, they do have an air force, and they do have support, military support. On the other side of my little walk down this corridor, this sandy road, I look at Gaza, and obviously the Hamas militants have guns, and possibly grenades, and maybe a few missiles left. But the fact is that when you look at both sides, it's quite hypocritical to ignore the atrocities, the worst atrocities that have occurred in this century on planet Earth that are occurring in Gaza, while concentrating on the atrocities which are occurring in the Ukraine. I mean, for us to ignore, as a people, for us to ignore what's happening in Gaza means that we accept what's happening there has something that we have no relationship to. It's just extraordinary when you think about it. I mean, wouldn't it be easy for the Australian government just to expel the Israeli ambassador and say, look, sir, when you broker a permanent ceasefire, you can come back. Not even called in for an explanation. Not even called in for an explanation. So as I keep saying, there are good nuclear bombs and bad nuclear bombs. And the good nuclear bombs are the bombs that we have, and the bad nuclear bombs are the bombs the other people have. And there are good wars and bad wars. And the good wars are people, who we support, and the bad wars are those that, I won't even go on. You know what I'm trying to say. Because it's horrendous. If bombing was enough, if invasion wasn't enough, if the murder of so many innocent civilians wasn't enough, we now have the situation where we just accept it as a fait accompli. For example, Russia bombs Ukraine, 3, 4, 20 people get killed. We agree it's terrible. We send armaments to Ukraine. We support Ukraine as a country in their struggle. 50 Palestinians get killed today, 70 tomorrow. Babies are starving. People can't get access to basic medical care. Hospitals are bombed, schools are bombed, tents are bombed by an overwhelming military force. Aircraft are used by all those heroes in the Israeli Defence Forces. And what do? Shrug our shoulders. Occasionally the Prime Minister opens his mouth. Shrug our shoulders. We accept it as a fait accompli. If we, as a civilisation, can't or are unwilling to address this situation, it highlights the total failure of civilisation in the 21st century. Let's move on. National Disaster Centre. Now, obviously, even blind Joe, me, knows that the climate emergency is beginning to have an impact on Australian society. Unless you're a member of the National Party, let's not forget that. They don't accept science, all right? Let's not forget that, because we'll talk about them another day. That crew, wonderful people. Close your eyes and forget there's a drought, forget there's floods, forget there's cyclones, but they're coming more and more regularly. Oh, they've always been there, you know. So let's forget about those lads and lasses, you know. They know their people, don't they? And while people in the regions continue to think that the National Party are their saviours, they will continue to find themselves in increasingly difficult situations. And I live in the regions, all right? So I've got a right to criticise. I'm not a bloody city slicker. So here we have all these disasters unfolding. A flood here, a drought here, cyclone there, fire here, you know. It's beginning to have an impact on a lot of people. Now, we in this country rely on private insurance to protect our assets, our home. If you're lucky enough to have a home, you insure it. Now, insurance companies are private entities. They're there to make a buck. They're not there to provide welfare, okay? And they've got brains. And they look at the climate and they look at what's happening around the place. And they say to themselves, well, we're not going to insure you, or we're going to make the premiums so high there's no way you'll be able to afford them, because you're going to lose this money. We're not the government. We're not a charity. We're here to make money for our shareholders. That's what insurance is all about. I mean, you insure 1,000 people, you hope only one's house burns down and you make a profit out of it and give them the money to rebuild their house. Now, when the Insurance Council of Australia tells us there are over 200,000 homes in New South Wales alone that are uninsurable because they're on a floodplain, you begin to understand the enormity of the problem. And there's two issues. One, there's the immediate response, and two, there's the long-term response, especially for those people who lose everything because they cannot afford private insurance. Now, I've spoken about this ad nauseum for over 2 decades, but I'll speak again. There's no point relying on the Australian Defence Forces. What we need is national disaster centres across the country. Centres that are equipped and staffed with people that can react instantly to disasters, like an ambulance. All right? This costs money, obviously. And I'm talking about maybe one disaster centre for every 500,000 people living in a large city. Maybe one disaster centre for every 250,000 people living in regional Australia. And maybe one disaster centre for every 100,000 people living in rural Australia. To provide that instant assistance that's required. in terms of accommodation, in terms of, helping people, in terms of saving people. But then there's the long-term issue. What do we do with all those people who are now deemed to be uninsurable by the private insurance industry? Isn't it about time that we had a discussion about a national, government-owned insurance entity to ensure that people don't lose everything if they find themselves in a situation where private companies refuse to insure them? In many regards, we find ourselves in this situation because we have allowed development to occur on areas where no development should have occurred because of pressure from the private construction industry, private housing industry. But the dilemma is it's there now. And it's all very well to say to people, well, bad luck, mate. You didn't pay any insurance. You're going to have to put up with it. Now, over 20 years ago, I was involved in a major house fire. If I didn't have insurance, we'd be out ship creek. And I can understand personally how people feel in these situations. It's not just the fact that your house burns down, but your livelihood goes. All the property you have in that house goes. The memories you have disappear. And if we as a society can't organise national disaster centres across the country as the climate emergency becomes more and more extreme, and we can't organise some type of mechanism via which we can actually guarantee that people who find themselves in particular regions where private insurance company won't insure or refuse to, to give a reasonable premium, that if we can't look after our fellow Australians, our fellow brothers and sisters, maybe, just maybe, we should be looking at ourselves. Thank you for listening to the Anarchist World this week, broadcast across Australia by the Community Radio Network. This program has been streaming live on 3cr.org.au. The program is podcast. You can access the podcast by going to 3cr.org.au. YouTube channels, Public Interest Before Corporate Interest. Facebook page, pibc.net. YouTube channel, josephtoscano.nam. Facebook page, Joseph Toscano. Web page, anarchistmedia.org. The list goes on and on. There's lots of stuff out there. I'm not going to ask you to become a friend, but what I'd like you is to get involved. And don't forget, the 11th of June, Radiothon, we need to raise $20,000. Get your money out of your pocket. If Gina can do it in a second, I should be able to do it in an hour. Thank you once again for listening to the Anarchist World this week on your local community radio station. Irrespective of where you're listening to this program, let's thank the people at the Community Radio Network for ensuring the Anarchist World this week reaches your local community radio station.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.